Nightmare Night Party hat on her head appeared floating in front of the shocked Pip and Apple Bloom. "Ah, Princess Luna, the party isn't over already, is it?" The two looked at her in shock. "Scootaloo." Both Pip and Apple Bloom gasped. "Hi guys, she finally caught you." The orange Pegasus cheerfully waved at her friends with a big smile on her face. "How are you alive, and why do you have a hat on?" the confused Pipsqueak asked. "Oh, Princess Luna is having a nightmare night party in her tummy." "So is every pony okay?" Apple Bloom asked. "Yeah, every pony is having a great time down there. She has punch and lots of candy too." Apple Bloom couldn't help but let out a slight chuckle at this. She slowly looked back up at Luna, who gave a warm smile at the little filly, then to Pipsqueak, who still looked a little confused. "I promise I would never hurt any of you." Luna levitated Pip towards her giant face, making the little colt give out a slight yell. Luna pressed the colt against her blue cheek. "It's all right, Pip." Pipsqueak felt the warmth from the alicorn's face. Luna gently placed a hoof on the tiny child's body as if to hold him in place. Pipsqueak looked up into the alicorn's eyes. She didn't take her stare off the little colt. Pip was starting to feel like he had his favorite princess back. He gave a small smile, then snuggled into Luna's soft blue fur. Apple Bloom giggled a bit at the cute spectacle while Scootaloo made some fake gagging noises. Luna blinked, then stared down Scootaloo, making the orange Pegasus smile nervously. Luna gave an evil smile, then sent a floating Scootaloo to her opening mouth. "Aw, come on! Not again!" she said as she was sent past Luna's teeth, then plopped onto her spongy tongue. Luna closed her maw, swallowing her a second time. Apple Bloom and Pipsqueak gave an awkward silence, staring at a nervous Luna who hoped she didn't just scare them again, but after a bit, Apple Bloom let out a light chuckle. "Poor Scoots!" Pipsqueak giggled along with Apple Bloom, then soon after, Luna shared her laughter with the tiny foals. "So you're not afraid of me, are you?" Apple Bloom looked up at Luna and was going to say no. "Nope, you're the scariest princess ever." Pipsqueak smiled, looking proud of what he said. Apple Bloom became nervous, hoping that Luna wouldn't be offended, but to the filly's surprise, Luna gave a big smile. "Good, that's what I like to hear." Luna nuzzled little Pip with her massive snout. "So, are we going to join them?" Apple Bloom smiled a bit. "Well, of course, that is, if you two are not scared, are you?" Luna asked. They shook their heads. "We know we're not in any danger now," Pip replied. "Good, well then I suppose it's time to join your friends." Luna smiled, then opened her maw, giving the foals a great view of her open mouth. The two foals looked into her mouth, peering into the gaping abyss that was her throat. Apple Bloom and Pipsqueak were gently placed in the center of Luna's soft moist tongue. The tiny filly and colt stared in amazement at the princess's mouth. Princess Luna's teeth were a perfect white. Colgate would be proud of her. No cavities seen anywhere, especially in her back teeth. The inside of her mouth were a dark red. Saliva soaked the surface, the walls, and dripped off of her top rows of teeth and the back of throat and her uvula. Pipsqueak stood up and took notice that his little hooves sunk deep onto the moist tongue. "Whoa!" He lifted up his hoof, then placed it back on the tongue, making a squishing sound. Apple Bloom stood up as well, looking around the night princess mouth in amazement. The little filly pressed her hoof in Luna's tongue. "Yuck!" Apple Bloom pulled her hoof back, wiping off the saliva. She stepped back, then slipped backwards, landing on soft surface. Pip giggled a bit at this. Apple Bloom gave an evil smile, then pulled on Pip's leg, making him fall face first into Luna's tongue, making a squashing sound. Pip was dumbfounded, but gave a big smile and laughed. Apple Bloom joined in on the laughter. The two playfully began pushing each other over, making Luna giggle from the feeling. Apple Bloom playfully chased Pip around Luna's mouth, jumping off and on her teeth and bouncing on her spongy tongue. Pip dashed from the left, then slipped under the tongue, making Luna giggle as the two played in her mouth, letting them have their fun. Apple Bloom and Pip had stopped playing and relaxed on Luna's soft tongue, both of them resting together between the soft center of the fleshy hills of the alicorn's tongue. Luna felt the tiny folds take rest on her tongue. Luna looked up at her horn. She made the tip of her horn glow, then shoot out a tiny spark of blue and white light. The little spark floated from her horn then into her open mouth. Luna then closed her mouth, sealing the folds in the darkness. The only light viewable was the tiny spark that hovered over Pip and Apple Bloom, which then glowed bright, giving the foals night light in her mouth. "Thank you, Luna." Pip hugged the soft tongue. Luna smiled and nodded. "You're quite welcome. Just let us know when you are ready to join your friends," Luna reminded. Apple Bloom took notice of the warm breeze coming from behind them. She turned her head to see the motion of her throat moving as Luna breathed in and out. Apple Bloom saw the uvula moving back and forth. She smiled and tapped Pip on the shoulder. "What?" Pip looked at her in confusion. Apple Bloom pointed at Luna's uvula and smiled evilly. Pip looked at the uvula then showed his own evil smile. Luna giggled as she felt the two stopping. "What are you two doing in there?" Apple Bloom and Pip walked across the slimy tongue to edge of the alicorn's throat. Pip looked at the slow swaying uvula in amazement. "This is gonna be fun." Pip reached up and touched the bottom of the uvula then drew his hoof back. "This is like being in a sea monster's mouth," he laughed. "Or maybe in a whale's mouth," Apple Bloom added as she pressed her hoof on the uvula, making it swing. Apple Bloom and Pip backed away as the uvula slowly began to stop swinging and resort back to its normal motion. Apple Bloom and Pip Squeak looked at themselves then nodded. "You ready?" she asked. "Yup." Pip and Apple Bloom took 4 steps back, then raced to the uvula and leapt up, both grasping hold of the uvula. Luna giggled as she felt the two playing with her uvula. "Oh, you little troublemakers." The two foals laughed as they swung on Luna's uvula. "Hold on, Pip." Apple Bloom cheered and giggled as her and Pip snuggled in the soft uvula. Luna giggled as she felt the two hanging from the dangling flesh. The uvula swung back then swung forward to the front of her mouth. Both Apple Bloom and Pip Squeak were flung onto the spongy tongue, making a squishing sound. The two foals laughed. Even if they were covered in saliva, this was the most fun they had on any nightmare night. "Princess Luna, thanks for everything." Apple Bloom giggled. Luna smiled warmly. "You're quite welcome, little filly." Pip Squeak hugged the tongue and snuggled into it. "You're still the best princess ever." "I'm glad to hear that," Luna replied. Pip walked across the tongue back to Luna's throat. He stopped at the edge then stood up and hugged the uvula. She smiled a bit. "Are you both ready now?" "I am." Pip cheered standing at the edge of the throat. "Yeah, so am I," Apple Bloom said standing next to Pip Squeak. Luna smiled and nodded, then tilted her head back, sending them into the entrance of her throat. Pip Squeak entered into the fleshy tunnel first, and then followed behind by Apple Bloom. The slimy muscles closed, then opened around the filly and colt, pulling them down into the esophagus. Luna smiled, following the bulge they made in her throat until it disappeared into her chest. The two slid down the slimy tunnel laughing in joy as they traveled downward. Luna smiled as she felt the two plop into her belly. Apple Bloom and Pip landed into a soft wet floor that bounced them up and down like a trampoline. Pip Squeak wiped his head from the saliva sticking to him. Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo walked up to them with party hats on their heads and holding cups of punch. "Hey, you guys made it!" Sweetie Belle and Scootaloo offered the cups to Apple Bloom and Pip. "Yeah, we were worried you wouldn't make it." Scootaloo patted Pip on the back. "We were worrying the same thing about you guys." Apple Bloom and Pip Squeak both chuckled. "Well, no need to worry. Now come on, let's show around." Scootaloo took the lead as Apple Bloom and Pip followed behind. As the four walked, their hooves made a squishing sound on the ruby red floor. They walked around a fleshy corner